Now to Georgia, where overnight protests have continued into the morning in a last-ditch effort to prevent the passing of a controversial law. The bill requires organisations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence or face fines. Western countries and Georgia's opposition have denounced it as authoritarian and Russian-inspired, but the country's Prime Minister vowed on Sunday to push ahead with the law. Our South Caucasus correspondent Rehan Dimitri says despite the efforts of protesters, the law is unlikely to be voted down.
Well, it looks increasingly unlikely given that it took just 67 seconds for the Legal Affairs Committee that held the third and final reading of this controversial law this morning to pass the third reading. You can see behind me some protesters still remain in the street and they're blocking this main thoroughfare here in Tbilisi outside Parliament. They're sitting on the ground and holding their ground. They're waiting for more students to join the protest. I was just talking to one of the students from the medical university and she says that they have about 6,000 students at the university. They're all boycotting their studies and they're planning to join the protest. And we know that the similar picture is happening at several other universities here in Tbilisi. So the students want to come to reinforce what's been happening overnight. And they're still hoping that the government might hear their voices and withdraw this controversial bill.
And tell us what the impact would be if the bill did go through.
Well, what these people are worried about the most is, of course, that it would restrict the democratic freedoms in the country. They're worried that by introducing this law, although the government says, look, it's just about, transparency of financing, just submit your annual report and tell us where the money is coming from and what are you spending it on. But this bill also comes with the title that these organizations and independent media, they would have to label themselves as an organization acting in the interest of a foreign power. And protesters are worried that it would ultimately kind of silence these organizations. But more than that, they're worried that by adopting this law, that the government is kind of making a U-turn on Georgia's foreign policy. And we know that more than 80% of Georgians want and see their country's future as part of the EU. And as they dub this law, the Russian law, they're worried that its adoption would mean that they're somehow going back to Russia.
For more on this, let's speak to Alex Scrivener, Executive Director of the Democratic Security Institute, a pro-democracy think tank based in Tbilisi. And I understand overnight you were at the demonstrations. Do you have any hope that it may still prevent the government passing this law?
Well, historically, protests in Georgia do work. This law was an attempt to pass this law, something very similar to it last year, and mass street protests forced the government to U-turn. Unfortunately, this time, the government seems much more intent in putting its law through, and that has caused even larger protests. And we're at a stage now where it feels like there's a standoff. The overwhelming majority of Georgians, 80 to 90% of which support EU membership, are out, supporting these protests. This government was elected in 2020 on a mandate of supporting EU membership, and now we have a government here which has U-turned on that and is insistent on passing this law, which EU and US officials have been very clear in saying that it is incompatible with EU membership.
Yes, we had last week, we had President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, tweeting saying that Georgia is at a crossroads. It should stay stay the course on the road to Europe. So do you really think that it would jeopardise that path to Europe, to being part of Europe, if this does go ahead?
Oh, there's no question about that at all. Despite the government rhetoric, it's absolutely clear that this law is incompatible with further progress on Georgia's path to EU membership. And that's clear from statements from EU officials and from legal analysis of the text. This is basically a copy-paste job of similar legislation in a whole range of authoritarian countries, most controversially Russia, but also Azerbaijan, Hungary, and other places where there have been crackdowns on civil society freedoms. And the EU has been very clear that if Georgia passes this, then EU membership is off the table while it's on the books.
Alex Scrivener, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on the subject.